The winter sky over the English Channel erupts in fire. December 1944. A V-1 flying bomb, Hitler's terror weapon, screams toward London at 400 miles per hour. No human gunner can track it. No mechanical time fuse can predict its path. But tonight, something new guards the skies. An American destroyer fires a single 5-inch shell. The round doesn't need to hit. It doesn't need luck. 50 feet from the robot bomb, the shell simply knows. A radio pulse bounces back. Circuits close. The warhead detonates. The V-1 disintegrates into flaming debris that tumbles into the black water below. In the destroyer's fire control room, sailors stare at each other in disbelief. The proximity fuse has just changed warfare forever. And 300 miles east, in a concrete bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin, German scientists clutch the twisted fragments of an American shell, racing against time to unlock its secrets. They have no idea they're about to build a weapon that will turn against them with devastating consequences. Before we continue the story of how German desperation led to catastrophic failure, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're listening from. Which city? Which state? I'm curious to know who's brave enough to discover what happened when Nazi engineers tried to steal America's deadliest secret. The story begins 3 years earlier, in a cramped laboratory at Johns Hopkins University, where the future of warfare takes shape inside a device no bigger than a grapefruit. It's September 1941. America isn't yet at war, but the men gathered in this room know that's only a matter of time. Dr. Merle Tuve, Section Chief of the National Defense Research Committee, stands before a workbench scattered with vacuum tubes, radio components, and the gutted shells of artillery rounds. His white coat is stained with solder flux. His eyes are bloodshot from 70-hour weeks. In his hand, he holds what looks like an ordinary anti-aircraft shell nose. But inside that steel casing, packed with miniaturized radio equipment that pushes the limits of 1941 technology, lies a revolution. The problem is simple to understand, but fiendishly difficult to solve. Anti-aircraft guns in 1941 fire shells that explode based on mechanical time fuses. A gunner estimates the target's altitude and speed, sets the fuse accordingly, and hopes the shell detonates near enough to damage the aircraft. Against a bomber flying straight and level at 15,000 feet, this works reasonably well. Against a diving fighter or a maneuvering reconnaissance plane, the hit rate drops to less than 1%. Gunners fire thousands of rounds to bring down a single aircraft. Entire convoys burn because their escorts can't stop German dive bombers. The math is brutal and unforgiving. America needs a shell that can think. The solution requires cramming a complete radio transmitter, receiver, amplifier, and detonator circuit into a package that can survive being fired from a gun, an acceleration force of 20,000 times gravity. Every component must be miniaturized, ruggedized, and absolutely reliable. The shell must emit radio waves, detect their reflection off a nearby aircraft, amplify that signal through vacuum tubes no bigger than a woman's lipstick, and trigger the detonator at precisely the right distance. All of this must happen in the few seconds between leaving the gun barrel and passing the target. And it must cost less than $50 per unit to manufacture in quantities of millions. The engineers call it the variable time fuse. The military designates it VT. History will know it as the proximity fuse. By early 1942, the prototype works. Test rounds fired at the Dahlgren Naval Proving Ground in Virginia successfully detonate near target sleeves towed by aircraft. The success rate exceeds 80%, a quantum leap over mechanical fuses. But success in a controlled test is one thing. Combat is another. The device must work in rain, snow, and tropical humidity. It must survive storage in ship magazines for months. It must be simple enough for sailors and soldiers to handle under fire. And above all, its existence must remain absolutely secret. If the enemy captures an intact fuse and learns its principles, they can build their own. Or worse, they can develop jamming systems that render American fuses useless. The Pentagon makes a decision. The proximity fuse will be used only over water, where duds will sink rather than fall into enemy hands. The technology is too valuable to risk. The first combat test comes in January 1943. The cruiser USS Helena, operating in the Solomon Islands, faces a dusk raid by Japanese bombers. The gun crews load the new ammunition with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Rumors have circulated about miracle shells, but sailors have learned not to trust rumors. The bombers come in low and fast, skimming the wave tops to avoid radar detection. At 3,000 yards, the Helena's 5-inch guns open fire. The first salvo seems to explode prematurely. The gunners curse, thinking the fuses are defective. Then they see the bombers. 3 aircraft, torn apart by airbursts they never saw coming. A 4th trails smoke and flame, cartwheeling into the sea. The remaining attackers break off, their formation shattered. In the span of 90 seconds, the Helena has achieved what would normally require 20 minutes of sustained fire and hundreds of rounds. The gun crews stand stunned. One loader, a farm boy from Nebraska, crosses himself and whispers that they've just witnessed something unholy. The gunnery officer knows better. They've witnessed the future. News of the proximity fuse spreads through Navy channels with the speed and secrecy of a classified revolution. By mid-1943, every major warship in the Pacific Fleet carries stocks of VT ammunition. Carrier task forces, once vulnerable to kamikaze attacks, become floating fortresses of automated death. Japanese pilots find themselves flying into walls of precisely detonated explosions. The psychological impact is as devastating as the physical destruction. Enemy aviators begin to report that American ships are protected by some kind of invisible barrier, a weapon that kills without needing to aim. Intelligence officers dismiss these reports as combat stress or propaganda. But the truth is simpler and more terrifying. American technology has leaped a generation ahead. In Europe, the situation is more complex. The Luftwaffe, though weakened by years of attrition, still poses a significant threat. But British and American commanders are paranoid about the proximity fuse falling into German hands. The weapon remains restricted to naval use and to anti-aircraft batteries positioned where duds will fall into the sea. This changes in December 1944, when V-1 flying bombs begin raining down on London in devastating numbers. The robot bombs fly too fast and too low for conventional anti-aircraft fire. Barrage balloons are ineffective. Fighter interception works, but pilots must risk collision to shoot down the missiles. Britain is being terrorized by machines, and machines require a mechanical response. The decision is made. Proximity-fused ammunition will be issued to anti-aircraft batteries defending London. Security risks be damned. The alternative is to let the city burn. The results are immediate and spectacular. V-1 interception rates, previously hovering around 25%, suddenly leap to over 70%. Londoners, who have learned to dread the distinctive buzzing of the flying bombs and the terrible silence when their engines cut out, begin to notice something different. The robots are exploding in midair, miles from their targets. The explosions come in clusters, as if invisible gunners in the sky are methodically swatting the weapons from the air. Morale, ground down by months of bombardment, begins to recover. The Home Guard reports that fewer volunteers are needed to clear rubble because fewer bombs are getting through. And in the cellars and bunkers where British intelligence operates, analysts know that every destroyed V-1 is also a destroyed secret. Sooner or later, the Germans will recover an intact fuse. The clock is ticking. The moment arrives on a freezing morning in January 1945. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot, flying a high-altitude mission over the Belgian coast, spots something unusual in a frozen marsh near Antwerp. Metal debris, scattered in a pattern consistent with an anti-aircraft burst. But this debris includes an intact shell nose, half buried in ice. The pilot radios the coordinates. Within hours, a recovery team is on site. They extract the shell casing with the care of archaeologists handling a pharaoh's treasure. The nose is damaged, but not destroyed. Inside, the miniature radio equipment is intact enough to study. The shell is packed in sawdust, loaded onto a transport, and flown to Berlin. By nightfall, it sits on a workbench in a laboratory deep beneath the Reich Air Ministry. German scientists, who have been theorizing about American air defense capabilities for months, finally have proof. The enemy has developed a proximity fuse, and Germany must have one too. The German scientific establishment in early 1945 is a shadow of its former glory. The great research institutes have been bombed, evacuated or stripped of talent by conscription. Physicists who once pursued pure research now design weapons in underground factories. Chemists synthesize ersatz materials to replace resources cut off by blockade. Engineers work with chronic shortages of copper, rubber, and rare earth elements. The scientists examining the American proximity fuse understand immediately that they face an impossible task. The device before them represents hundreds of thousands of man-hours of development, precision manufacturing that requires intact factories, and rare materials that Germany can no longer obtain in sufficient quantities. But orders from above are explicit. Replicate the fuse. Do it quickly. The survival of the Reich depends on it. The team is led by Dr. Wilhelm Runge, a former university professor who now wears the Feldgrau uniform of a Wehrmacht technical officer. Runge is a capable physicist, but he's not a miracle worker. He disassembles the American fuse with painstaking care, photographing and documenting each component. The miniaturization alone is astounding. Vacuum tubes no bigger than a thumbnail. Circuitry etched onto ceramic substrates with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. A battery chemistry that can survive 20,000 gravities of acceleration. Every element represents a separate engineering challenge. And Runge knows, with the sick certainty of a man watching a house collapse in slow motion, that Germany cannot replicate this. Not in 1945, not with the resources available, not in the time remaining before the Reich ceases to exist. But orders are orders. Runge assembles a team of 30 engineers and technicians. They're given priority access to whatever materials can be scavenged. They work in a reinforced basement that shakes with every Allied bombing raid. The lights flicker, water drips from ceiling cracks, and slowly, painfully, they begin to build a German proximity fuse. They simplify where they can. They substitute available materials for scarce ones. They cut corners that American engineers would never consider. The result is a device that looks similar to the American original, but functions on fundamentally compromised principles. It's heavier, less reliable, and far more sensitive to shock, but it does work, after a fashion. In static tests, mounted on a laboratory bench, the German fuse successfully detects a metal target and triggers a test charge. Runge writes an optimistic report. His superiors, desperate for good news, order immediate production. The first batch of 200 fuses is delivered to an anti-aircraft battery defending the Ruhr industrial region in March 1945. The battery commander, a veteran of 4 years of air defense operations, is skeptical but willing to try anything. His crews have been engaging American bomber formations with minimal success. The B-17s fly in tight boxes, bristling with machine guns, protected by swarms of P-51 fighters. His 88mm guns, once the terror of Allied air crews, now feel inadequate against the massed aerial armadas that blacken the sky daily. The new fuses, he is told, will revolutionize his battery's effectiveness. He inspects the shells personally. They look correct. The fuses are clearly German manufacture, cruder than standard time fuses, but functional. He orders his crews to load mixed ammunition, half conventional, half proximity, for the next engagement. The American bombers arrive at noon, 300 B-17s, flying at 25,000 feet, en route to flatten what remains of German oil production. The battery opens fire. The first rounds are conventional shells with time fuses. They burst in the general vicinity of the bomber stream, dark puffs of smoke that the flying fortresses ignore. Then the first proximity-fused shell leaves the barrel. It travels 200 feet. The radio circuit activates, detects the gun barrel behind it, interprets this as a target, and detonates. The explosion is not a distant airburst against enemy bombers. It is a point-blank blast that shreds the gun barrel, kills 3 crewmen instantly, and wounds 5 others. The battery commander, watching from his command post, sees his number 2 gun simply disintegrate in a flash of fire and steel. Before he can issue orders, number 4 gun fires. Same result. The shell detonates almost immediately, turning the gun into twisted wreckage. Then number 1. Then number 6. In the span of 30 seconds, a German anti-aircraft battery destroys itself. The surviving crew members throw down their equipment and run. Some are screaming. Others are too shocked to make sound. The battery commander stands frozen, watching his command immolate. The American bombers fly overhead, untouched, unaware that they've just been saved not by their own defenses, but by German self-destruction. The few shells that didn't prematurely detonate have achieved nothing. The battery is ruined. The commander will face a court-martial for incompetence. And hundreds of miles away, in his laboratory beneath Berlin, Dr. Runge receives a terse message via military telegram. The fuses are failing catastrophically. Explain immediately. Runge and his team work through the night, trying to understand what went wrong. They test the fuses in the laboratory. They function correctly. They mount a fuse on a test gun at a nearby proving ground. They fire one round. The shell detonates immediately, destroying the gun. The problem is suddenly, horrifyingly clear. The German fuse is too sensitive. It cannot distinguish between the metal of the gun barrel it's being fired from and the metal of a distant aircraft. Or more precisely, it prioritizes the closer target. The gun barrel, being only inches away when the fuse activates, generates a stronger radar reflection than any aircraft could at combat range. The American fuse avoids this problem through some combination of delayed activation, directional sensing, or filtering algorithms that German engineers, working from a partial sample and incomplete understanding, have failed to replicate. The German proximity fuse is not just defective, it is perfectly, consistently, reliably defective. It will destroy every gun that fires it. Runge sends an urgent report up the chain of command. Production must halt immediately. All existing fuses must be recalled. The project is a failure. But military bureaucracy, especially the bureaucracy of a collapsing dictatorship, moves slowly. More batteries receive shipments of the defective fuses. Some commanders, having heard rumors of problems, refuse to use them. Others, desperate to stop the daily bomber streams, ignore the warnings. More guns are destroyed. More crews are killed by their own ammunition. German military efficiency, already strained to breaking by years of war, suffers another self-inflicted wound. The proximity fuse project, intended to counter Allied air superiority, instead weakens German air defenses further. By April 1945, the program is quietly cancelled. The remaining fuses are collected and destroyed. The official records blame sabotage, a convenient fiction that spares commanders from admitting their own scientific inadequacy. Runge and his team are reassigned to other hopeless projects. Jet fighters that have no fuel, tanks that have no crews, fortifications that have no purpose. The Reich is dying. The proximity fuse fiasco is merely one small abscess in a body already riddled with fatal wounds. But for the soldiers who died when their own guns exploded, for the air crews who fell because their anti-aircraft protection destroyed itself, the disaster is total and final. The American scientists who developed the original proximity fuse learn about the German attempts only after the war ends. In the summer of 1945, Allied intelligence teams sweep through German research facilities, collecting documents and interrogating scientists. They find Runge's reports. They examine the defective German fuses, and they are simultaneously impressed and appalled. Impressed that German engineers managed to create a functioning proximity sensor under wartime conditions with limited resources. Appalled that the Germans rushed a fatally flawed weapon into production without adequate testing. Dr. Merle Tuve, reading the captured reports in his office at Johns Hopkins, shakes his head in something close to sympathy. The Germans faced an impossible task, he concludes, and they approached it with characteristic desperation. The result was inevitable. The full statistical impact of the proximity fuse is calculated in the months after Japan's surrender. American analysis shows that VT-fused ammunition increased anti-aircraft effectiveness by a factor of 3 to 4 over conventional time-fused shells. A gun battery using proximity fuses could achieve the same results as 3 or 4 batteries using standard ammunition. This translated into fewer ships sunk, fewer aircraft lost, fewer soldiers and sailors killed by enemy air attack. The numbers are staggering. An estimated 20,000 American lives saved. Hundreds of ships that would have been destroyed, sailing home intact. The proximity fuse alone did not win the war, but it created a shield of technology that preserved American fighting strength while enemy capabilities eroded. And the German attempt to copy it, rather than narrowing the gap, widened it into a chasm. The German scientists who worked on the proximity fuse project scatter into the post-war world. Some are recruited by American intelligence, their expertise in radio technology valued despite their failures. Others return to civilian life, teaching in rebuilt universities, writing memoirs that carefully omit their role in the self-destructive weapons program. Runge himself emigrates to Switzerland, where he spends the rest of his career working on radio astronomy, as far from military applications as he can possibly get. He refuses to discuss his wartime work. When colleagues press, he says only that he learned the difference between understanding a principle and successfully implementing it under pressure. The lesson cost lives, and he carries that weight silently until his death in 1967. The proximity fuse story becomes classified immediately after the war, part of the vast ocean of military secrets that the Cold War keeps hidden. American servicemen who fired the miracle shells are forbidden from discussing the technology. The official histories mention VT ammunition only in passing, without technical details. But in the archives of naval warfare, in the after-action reports from hundreds of Pacific engagements, the evidence is overwhelming. Ships that should have been sunk survived. Kamikaze attacks that should have succeeded were shattered by walls of precisely detonated explosions. The proximity fuse created an invisible advantage that compounded over time, allowing American forces to concentrate on offense because their defense required fewer resources. The German failure, by contrast, demonstrates the limits of desperation. Copying advanced technology requires not just understanding its principles, but mastering the entire supporting infrastructure, the manufacturing precision, the quality control, the materials science, the iterative testing that identifies and corrects flaws before they become catastrophic. Germany in 1945 possessed brilliant scientists, but lacked the time, resources, and industrial stability to translate intelligence into capability. The attempt to rush a proximity fuse into production without fully understanding its mechanisms created a weapon more dangerous to its users than to the enemy. This pattern of German ingenuity undermined by resource constraints and bureaucratic pressure repeated throughout the war's final year. Jet aircraft without fuel, tanks without trained crews, weapons without ammunition, and proximity fuses that destroyed the guns meant to fire them. The story concludes not with dramatic battles, but with quiet recognition. In 1945, the Naval Ordnance Laboratory presents Dr. Merle Tuve with a Certificate of Merit for his work on the proximity fuse. The ceremony is small, attended by military officials and fellow scientists who understand what has been achieved. Tuve accepts the recognition with characteristic modesty. He reminds the audience that the fuse was not his invention alone, but the product of hundreds of engineers, technicians, and manufacturers who turned theory into mass production. The real victory, he says, was not in the laboratory, but in the factories that produced 5 million proximity fuses by war's end, and in the training programs that taught sailors and soldiers to handle the technology reliably under fire. American victory came from systems, not miracles, from coordinated effort, not individual genius, and from the patience to test and refine until the technology actually worked, rather than rushing flawed devices into combat. The contrast with the German experience could not be sharper. Where American development proceeded methodically, with extensive testing at every stage, German efforts were compressed into desperate months. Where American industry could tool up for mass production with access to unlimited copper, rare earths, and precision manufacturing, German factories operated under bombardment with substitute materials and worn equipment. Where American security kept the proximity fuse secret until it had proven itself in combat, German intelligence only obtained samples after the technology was already mature and impossible to replicate quickly. The gap between the two approaches, patient development versus frantic copying, determined the outcome. And that outcome was measured in guns that worked versus guns that exploded, in lives saved versus lives lost, in victory versus collapse. Historians examining World War II often focus on grand strategy, major battles, and charismatic leaders. But beneath those dramatic headlines lies a substrate of technological competition that shaped every engagement. The proximity fuse exemplifies this hidden dimension of warfare. It was not glamorous. It did not inspire patriotic propaganda posters. Most Americans had never heard of it until decades after the war. But it changed the mathematics of air defense so fundamentally that Japanese and German air forces found themselves engaging an enemy they could not effectively attack. American ships and bases became fortresses not because of thicker armor or more guns, but because every gun became 3 times more effective overnight. And when Germany tried to match this capability through reverse engineering, the attempt backfired with tragic consequences, illustrating the vast gap between the American industrial scientific complex and its enemies. The men who loaded and fired proximity-fused shells rarely knew what made them work. They knew only that the new ammunition achieved hits that previously required luck. Gunners who had spent months watching their shells burst harmlessly in empty sky suddenly saw enemy aircraft falling in flames. The technology felt like magic, but it was actually something more impressive, the product of systematic research, rigorous testing, and manufacturing excellence applied at scale. And for the German crews who watched their guns explode from defective copies of that same technology, the experience was a bitter illustration of how far their nation had fallen behind. The proximity fuse was not just a weapon, it was proof that technological superiority, once established, is nearly impossible for a resource-starved opponent to overcome. In the decades since 1945, the proximity fuse has evolved into increasingly sophisticated forms. Modern smart munitions, guided missiles, and terminal homing systems all descend from the principles first demonstrated by Tuve's miniaturized radio circuits. The basic concept, a weapon that senses its target and detonates at optimal range, has become fundamental to military technology. Every anti-aircraft missile, every naval defense system, every smart bomb carries that legacy forward. And the story of German failure to replicate the technology remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of rushing development, ignoring testing protocols, and attempting to copy innovations without understanding the infrastructure required to make them work. Those lessons, learned in blood amid the collapse of the Third Reich, continue to inform military research and development today. The farm boy from Nebraska who witnessed the proximity fuse in action aboard the Helena returned home in 1946. He never spoke about the technology. It remained classified. But he carried memories of that moment when the bombers fell from the sky, destroyed by shells that seemed to think. Years later, reading a declassified article about the VT fuse, he recognized what he had seen. He cut out the article and kept it in his desk drawer, a small piece of paper explaining a moment when he had witnessed the future. When his grandchildren asked about the war, he told them about the Helena, about the Solomon Islands, about the bravery of his shipmates, but he also told them about the gun that couldn't miss, and about how American innovation had built a shield that saved lives rather than simply destroying enemies. That, he said, was what winning actually meant. Not just defeating the other side, but protecting your own people with tools that worked better than anything the enemy could field. And in the archives of naval intelligence, in the captured German reports translated and filed away in secure facilities, lies the other side of that story. The frantic messages from battery commanders reporting guns destroyed. The technical analysis explaining why the German proximity fuse failed so catastrophically. The bureaucratic memos trying to assign blame for a program that turned anti-aircraft batteries into self-destructing death traps. These documents, available now to researchers willing to wade through decades of military paperwork, paint a portrait of desperation, incompetence, and the inevitable collapse that comes when a nation tries to catch up to an opponent that has already lapped them. The German scientists were not stupid. They were simply fighting a losing battle against time, resources, and the accumulated advantages that come from starting research years earlier with full access to materials and manufacturing. They failed not because they lacked intelligence, but because they attempted the impossible. The proximity fuse story teaches a lesson that extends beyond military history. It demonstrates that technological advantage is not just about invention, but about implementation, the unglamorous work of turning a laboratory prototype into a mass-produced device that works reliably in the chaos of combat. It shows that copying advanced technology is far harder than it appears, requiring not just understanding, but replicating the entire ecosystem of materials, manufacturing, and quality control. And it illustrates that shortcuts taken under pressure usually fail at the worst possible moment. These principles apply to military technology, but they also apply to industrial competition, scientific research, and any field where sustained excellence requires patient development rather than desperate improvisation. The proximity fuse succeeded because America built it right. The German copy failed because desperation cannot substitute for capability. The war ended in 1945, but the competition it represented continues. Modern militaries invest billions in research, not just to develop new weapons, but to ensure their enemies cannot replicate them. Classified technologies remain secret, not just to prevent copying, but to preserve the advantage that comes from being generations ahead. And the memory of German guns exploding from their own ammunition serves as a reminder that attempting to match a technological superior through rushed reverse engineering is more likely to destroy your own capabilities than to bridge the gap. The proximity fuse was an American triumph, not just because it worked, but because it could not be copied in time to matter. That combination, innovation plus security plus manufacturing superiority, created a weapon that changed warfare while remaining beyond enemy reach. For the soldiers and sailors who fired those shells, who watched enemy aircraft fall without understanding exactly how the miracle occurred, the proximity fuse represented hope in a mechanized war. It proved that American technology could create advantages that saved lives, that innovation mattered as much as courage, that the war effort included scientists in laboratories working as hard as Marines on beachheads. And when they came home, those veterans carried the knowledge that they had been part of something larger than individual heroism, a coordinated national effort that combined research, industry, and military skill into a whole greater than its parts. That effort won the war. The proximity fuse was just one example among many, but it exemplified the principle perfectly. Build something the enemy cannot match. Build it well. Build it in quantities that overwhelm. And watch as their desperate attempts to catch up only accelerate their collapse. The last word belongs to the statistics. 5 million proximity fuses produced, threefold increase in anti-aircraft effectiveness, thousands of lives saved, hundreds of ships preserved, and in the rubble of German anti-aircraft positions, scattered wreckage from guns destroyed by their own ammunition, physical proof that technological superiority, once established, is almost impossible to overcome through desperation alone. The proximity fuse won its war silently, without headlines, transforming air defense from an art of prediction into a science of certainty. And the German attempt to copy it serves as history's answer to the question of whether desperation can substitute for capability. The answer, written in destroyed guns and wasted lives, is no. Not then, not ever.